The tea was still warm. That was the first thing Senna noticed every morning. The tea, sitting on the small table beside the window, pale amber in a clay cup that had belonged to her grandmother. She had brought it from the border village where she was born, packed it in wool, and carried it 3 days across the Ashfin Mountains when the Alpha King's summons came. It was the only thing in this palace that was entirely hers, and each morning she wrapped both hands around it and let the warmth travel up her wrists and remind her that she was still real. The second thing she noticed was the light. Dawn over the vile palace came slowly, the way grief does, first just a graying at the edges of the sky, then a long pause where nothing was quite dark anymore, but nothing was quite lit either. The courtyard below her window was empty. The guards had not yet changed rotation. The kitchen fires were just starting to breathe their first smoke up through the eastern chimney stacks, and the smell of wood smoke and cold stone rose through the cracked shutter, and she breathed it in and held it. She had maybe 1 hour. 1 hour before the palace fully woke. 1 hour before the Alpha King descended to his morning audience chamber, sat in the high carved chair his father had carved before him, and looked at her with eyes that held no recognition whatsoever. Pale gray eyes, the color of the sky outside right now, that beautiful waiting to be dawn gray. Eyes that would move across her face the way a man's gaze moves across furniture, registering her presence, cataloging her purpose, filing her understaff. Senna Ashvale, palace herbalist, approved by the court steward. No threat, no relevance, no name worth remembering. She set the tea down. Her hands had stopped shaking after the first month. She wasn't sure if that was progress. She had been in the palace for 4 months now, which meant she had watched him forget her 119 times. The curse reset at dawn. She had figured that out on the 3rd day, when she'd still believed the first 2 mornings were some sort of mistake, some temporary thing. Men forgot names, forgot faces. The palace was enormous, the staff was vast, and she had been brought in quietly by Lord Callum's recommendation rather than any formal presentation. It made sense, she'd told herself, that the Alpha King hadn't retained her name after their brief introduction. He had met 40 people that first morning. He was busy. He was powerful. He was, even then, even before she understood anything, the kind of man whose attention felt like standing in full sun, warming and slightly dangerous at the same time. So she'd introduced herself again on day 3, clearly, simply. "I'm Senna Ashvale, Your Highness, the herbalist Lord Callum appointed." He had looked at her with polite, absent interest and said, "Ashvale, from the border territories?" "Yes. Your work comes recommended. My chamberlain will direct you." And he had moved on. But on day 4, the previous day, the night before, she had stood in the palace greenhouse at twilight while he hunted through the rows of hanging dried plants for something he said his lower back ached for, and they had talked for 2 hours. He'd had a low voice when he wasn't performing authority, she'd discovered. Slower. He'd asked about the border territories, whether the flooding still came every 3rd spring, whether her family was still there. She had told him about her mother's hands, how they'd smelled of lemon verbena perpetually, how her mother had died in the last flood, 2 years prior, and the Alpha King, Calum, his name was Calum, though no one in the palace said it aloud, had gone quiet for a long moment and then said very quietly, "I'm sorry. I know what it is to lose the person who taught you everything you know." She hadn't known what to say to that. She'd said, "I know you do," because she did know. His father's death was 5 years past, but the palace still wore it in subtle ways. In the empty chair at the head of the secondary council table, in the way the older servants sometimes paused at the portrait gallery door. He had looked at her then as though she had said something unexpected. Not surprising. Unexpected. Like she'd used a word in a language he thought only he spoke. Day 5, he didn't know her name. That was when she understood something was wrong. She'd spent the next 6 weeks documenting it. She was an herbalist, and herbalists were, at their root, scientists. They observed. They recorded. They resisted the urge to conclude until the pattern was undeniable. She kept a small leather journal, the pages worn soft at the edges, and each night she wrote what she had learned of him that day, and each morning she wrote what he did not remember. The journal had grown dense. She'd had to begin compressing her handwriting. The pattern was always the same. At night, any night she managed to be near him, in the greenhouse, in the corridor near the physician's corridor, once in the library where he came alone after the council sessions and read with his boots off. He remembered her. More than remembered. Each time they spoke past the first 20 minutes, something shifted in him. A subtle dropping of formality, like a man taking off his coat in a room he finally trusted was warm enough. By dawn, gone. Not just her name, her face, their conversations, every word they'd traded, every moment of quiet and almost laughter and careful, charged honesty, erased. She walked into a room where the previous night she had made him smile, and he looked through her like glass. It was, she had written in her journal at the end of the 2nd month, the loneliest thing she had ever experienced in a life that had not been short on loneliness. But she hadn't left. She should have. She knew that. It was the flaw in her that she had examined from every angle and still couldn't quite dismantle. She was stubborn in the particular way of people who had been told all their lives that they were not quite enough, that they were too plain, too quiet, too from the border, too unremarkable to warrant keeping. Stubbornness had gotten her here. Stubbornness had made her good at what she did. And stubbornness, or something she was afraid to call by its true name, kept her waking before dawn to drink her tea and give herself 1 hour to prepare for the moment those gray eyes moved over her face and found nothing there. She would fix it. She would find the root of this curse and she would cut it out by hand if she had to. Because the man who forgot her every morning was not the only man who existed. There was a version of Calum Vile that lived only in the dark hours, and she had been falling in love with him for 4 months, and she refused. She absolutely refused to let that be for nothing. The palace had a mage. This was not a secret. Every pack court of consequence had one, the same way every court had a physician and a master of hounds. The Vale Court mage was a man named Oren, and he was 70 years old, possibly older. His age was the kind that stopped mattering at a certain point, where the number became irrelevant, and what remained was simply the impression of someone who had existed for a very long time and intended to continue. He wore a ring on his left thumb, always, a wide iron band set with a piece of dark amber, and his particular habit was touching it with his right forefinger when he was thinking. A small rhythmic press, 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 like a heartbeat he was keeping manually. Senna had gone to him in the 3rd week. She had framed her question carefully, the way you framed questions for powerful people who might not want to answer them. Obliquely, wrapped in professional language, made to sound like curiosity rather than accusation. "I've been researching memory-affecting compounds," she'd said, standing in the doorway of his chambers because he hadn't invited her to sit. Specifically those that could produce selective retrograde effects, targeting specific people or events while leaving the rest of the subject's memory intact. Oren had looked at her from across a table covered in glass vessels and dried materials she mostly recognized, and a few she didn't. His eyes were very dark, brown so deep they read black, set in a face so lined it had become its own kind of landscape. He'd pressed that ring with one finger. Press. 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 What an interesting area of inquiry, he'd said, in the voice of a man who found it not interesting at all. What is prompting it? Professional thoroughness. Of course. He'd paused. Memory affecting magic is complex. It rarely operates cleanly. Anyone attempting such a working on a powerful alpha would need to bind it to something, a trigger, a time marker. Otherwise, the working phrase. She had felt something tighten in her chest. He knew exactly what she was asking about. He was telling her, technically, without telling her. A time marker, she repeated. Like dawn, for instance. The press had stopped. I would be careful, Orrin said, about where your professional curiosity leads you, Miss Ashvale. The palace has many old workings. Some of them are there for protection. Whose? He had smiled then, and it had not reached his eyes. Good morning. She'd left, but she'd noted 3 things. He had not denied the working existed. He had used the word protection, and he had wished her good morning, not good day, not goodbye. At 9 a.m, as if reminding her that the important part of the day had already happened and what remained was merely aftermath. She didn't go back to Orrin. Not yet. She had other paths, and she was methodical. Methodical was what she had instead of allies, and she worked with what she had. The palace library held records going back 6 generations of Vial Alpha Kings. She requested access through the Chamberlain, citing professional research, and spent her mornings there in the weeks that followed, reading, cross-referencing, making notes in the small journal that she kept tucked inside her herbalist's apron. The dates she was looking for were approximately 5 years back, around the time of the late Alpha King's death, which was also approximately when, she had pieced this together from staff gossip and careful listening, Calum Vale had assumed full power of the throne. She found it in a secondary ledger. Not magic. The magic wouldn't be recorded in the administrative logs, but an absence, a gap. For 3 months around the late king's death and Calum's ascension, there was a period where the court logs recorded no personal audiences, no social functions, no names of individuals meeting privately with the new Alpha King. The administrative records were meticulous before and after. That gap was surgical. Someone had removed pages, not torn, excised. Done carefully, the binding intact, the removal only visible when you held the volume at an angle to the light and saw the slight difference in page thickness at the spine. Senna sat with the ledger in her hands and felt the shape of the thing she was looking at the way she felt the shape of a patient's problem before she'd identified the plant to treat it. Something had happened in those 3 months. Something that Orrin, or someone with access to the restricted archives, did not want findable. She closed the ledger. She needed to talk to Marit. Marit was the woman who brought Senna her morning tea. This was not her only function. She was a palace domestic, assigned to the residential East Wing, and she had worked in the Vial Palace for 31 years, which meant she had been there when Calum was born and had held, by her own quiet account, the record for most consecutive years of service without a single formal reprimand. She was 53, brown-skinned, with the kind of forearms built by decades of physical work, and she had a habit of humming to herself while she worked. Not songs exactly, more like the musical equivalent of thinking out loud, little melodic fragments that started and stopped without resolution. She was the only person in the palace who sometimes looked at Senna with something that was almost recognition. Not always, not consistently, but sometimes, in the corridor, or when she set the tea down and Senna thanked her, Marit would pause for just a half-second, her eyes going slightly distant, her humming stopping mid-fragment, as if she were trying to remember the end of something she'd heard before. Senna had been watching it for weeks. She'd decided it was time to test it. She waited until the morning after a particularly long evening with Calum. They had spent 3 hours in the greenhouse, later than she'd meant to stay, the moonlight coming through the glass in long, pale columns, and he had told her something she was sure he had never told another person. Something about the night his father died, and what he'd found in his father's chambers. And the next morning, before the tea cooled, she said to Moret without preamble, "Do you remember last night?" Moret had set the second cup down. She didn't answer immediately. The hum that she usually kept going went quiet. "Last night," Moret said carefully. "I was in the greenhouse," Senna said. "Late." A pause. Something moved across Moret's face. Not quite remembrance, not quite blankness. Something caught between the two, like a word at the tip of the tongue. The greenhouse is often used in the evening," Moret said finally. "It's one of His Highness's preferred—" "Moret." Senna kept her voice even. "Do you remember what the Alpha King's face looks like when he's not watching himself?" The hum did not restart. Moret looked at her for a long, careful moment. Then she picked up the empty tray she'd carried the tea in, tucked it under one arm, and walked to the door. She paused there, her back to Senna. "The south greenhouse," Moret said quietly, "has a bad latch on the third ventilation panel. It rattles when the wind comes from the east. Sounds like a voice almost. People report hearing things there." She left. Senna sat with her tea. She turned that over, the careful, oblique shape of what Moret had just said, the way it was and wasn't an answer. People report hearing things they aren't sure are real, things that might be the wind, might be memory, might be both. Moret half remembered, not everything, not clearly, but enough that she'd noticed, enough that she was being careful. She was not alone in this. The knowledge sat in Senna's chest like the first warm day after a long winter. Small, necessary, not enough, but there. It was on a night in the 5th month that the forced proximity happened, and Senna would later think that if the curse had had an architect, this was where that architect had miscalculated. Calum had been meeting with his war council all afternoon. She knew this from the sounds, the heavy boots in the corridor near the council chamber, the raised voices that her herbalist's quarters were unfortunately positioned to catch through the old ventilation shafts. The North Pack had been pushing against the border territories, which was a problem she understood viscerally because the border territories were where she was from. She had pressed her ear to nothing. She hadn't needed to. The voices came to her clearly. We cannot sustain another incursion, and the pack law requires him to ride personally. And finally, Calum's own voice, lower than the rest, controlled in the particular way of someone who had learned very young that control was the only thing that reliably protected him. "I am aware of what pack law requires." She was in the middle of grinding a dried preparation of feverfew when the knock came. Sharp. Twice. The knock of someone who was not accustomed to knocking. She opened the door. He stood in the corridor looking. She noted this carefully, storing it for later. Like a man who had expected to have somewhere to go after he raised his hand to this door and had just realized he didn't. His jaw was set. There was a cut along his left forearm, deep enough to need attention, from some sparring session or perhaps something from the war council that had progressed past argument. It was bleeding through the sleeve he'd rolled up, slow and persistent. The kind of wound that isn't dangerous but insists on your attention. He said, "Lord Callum said you carry wound preparations." "I do." "I'm told my physician is indisposed." "He is." She opened the door wider. "Come in." He looked at the open doorway, then at her, and something in his expression did something she'd learned to watch for. A very slight adjustment. the same way a man adjusts his breathing when he enters a room that smells different than expected. Not alarm. Recalibration. "You're the herbalist," he said. "Senna Ashvale." "Yes." He came in. Her room was small. This was simply a fact. Palace hierarchies dictated space as clearly as they dictated everything else, and an herbalist sat considerably below court physician in the ordering. She had done what she could with it. Bunches of dried plants hanging from the ceiling hooks meant for something else. Her grandmother's clay cup on the windowsill beside a neat row of labeled preparations. The table she used as a workspace covered in the organized chaos of someone who knew exactly where everything was. He sat where she indicated, on the low stool near the work table, and held his arm out with the particular patience of a man who hated waiting, but had decided, just now, to practice it. She worked quickly and well, cleaned the wound. His jaw tightened at the first touch, which told her the sting was sharp, though he made no sound. Applied a preparation of yarrow and calendula pressed into clean linen, and was halfway through binding it when she realized he was watching her face. Not her hands. Her face. She kept working. "You're not nervous," he said. "Should I be?" Most staff are. It wasn't arrogance the way he said it. Just a fact he'd observed so many times it had become weather. "When they're physically close to me." "I grew up treating pack injuries," Senna said. "Alphas, betas, everyone. The body is the same work regardless of the rank attached to it." He was quiet for a moment. She tied off the bandage, a clean double knot. "Where are you from?" he asked. Her hands stilled on the knot, just for a moment. "The border territories," she said. "You've asked me that before." Something moved across his face. "Have I?" "Months ago." She met his eyes. "When I was first appointed." He looked at her steadily, that gray gaze doing what it did, settling on her like weather. "I apologize for not retaining it. You don't need to apologize. I'm apologizing anyway." She held his gaze. Her heart was doing something she was trying to ignore. "Calum," she said, and then caught herself, because she didn't call him that. Not to his face. Not ever. But the word had already left her mouth, and she could feel the shape of her error, the intimacy of it, the way it landed in the small room. Silence stretched. She should correct herself, should say, "Your Highness," should give them both an out. He said, "No one calls me that." "I know. I apologize." "Why did you?" Her mouth was dry. She had told herself, 4 months ago, that she would be careful, that she would treat this like a medical problem, approached with the clinical detachment that her mother had taught her, and that had served her well. She had told herself she would not let herself be foolish. "It's your name," she said. "It fits you better than the title does." Another silence. The fire in the small grate ticked. Outside, the wind picked up, and somewhere in the palace, distantly, she heard the council chamber doors closing, the last of the war meeting dispersing into the night. "Stay," he said. She blinked. "I'm sorry?" "I'm not asking you to do anything." He sat back slightly on the stool, and there was something in the movement, a loosening, barely visible, like a fist unclenching. "I'm asking you to not leave yet, if you have no other pressing obligation." She had no other pressing obligation. She was alone every evening, and he would forget every morning, and she was so tired of being lonely in this specific, particular way. "I'll stay," she said. He told her things in the dark hours that she was beginning to think he had never said aloud. Not all at once. It happened in layers, the way plants reveal themselves. First the visible flower. Then, if you stay long enough and are quiet enough, the structure beneath. He had been Alpha King for 5 years. and 5 years of absolute power over a court that watched every expression and read every inflection had taught him a very particular stillness. He performed it constantly. The controlled voice, the measured gesture, the pause before every important sentence that gave nothing away. But he was not performing it right now. "The council wants me to make a formal bond offer to Lyra Stonefeld," he said. They had moved at some point, from her work table to the 2 chairs near the fire, not close, each chair properly spaced, and the fire had burned down to low red coals that gave the room the color of a held breath. "She is the Stonefeld Pack Alpha's daughter. It would secure the Northern Alliance." "Do you want that?" Senna asked. "What I want is rarely the relevant question." "That doesn't answer it." His jaw worked. The light from the coals picked out the sharp line of it, the slight tension he couldn't quite suppress even now. "No," he said. "I don't want it." "Have you told the council that?" "I've told the council that the Northern Alliance can be secured through trade agreements and doesn't require a bond offering." His voice went briefly dry. "They disagreed at length. They might be wrong. They might be." He looked at the coals. "My father would have married Lyra Stonefeld's counterpart without the conversation. Pack law, pack duty, the blood of the line. He was very clear about what that hierarchy looked like." "What did you think of that when you were younger?" A pause. The fire ticked. "I thought he was right," Calum said slowly. "I thought he was built for it in a way that I wasn't. That duty was easier for him. That the absence of want was something you could choose if you were strong enough." "And now?" "Now I'm not sure the absence of want is strength." He looked at her then, the full gray force of it. "I think it might just be a different kind of loss." Senna was very careful not to move, not to reach across the distance between the chairs, which was proper and correct, and the only thing keeping this from being something other than a conversation. The want in her own chest was a physical pressure, and she breathed it out slowly and kept her face calm. "He wasn't built differently than you," she said. "He just made different choices." Calum looked at her for a long moment. Then something in him, some taut thing, went soft. Just for a second. It was the most unguarded she had seen him look. More than the greenhouse conversations, more than the corridor encounters, because this time he knew she was watching and was choosing to let her see anyway. "You said that with a great deal of certainty," he said. "I spent 4 months watching you. I have data." His mouth moved. Not quite a smile, something to the left of one, something quieter than amusement. 4 months, at least. "And what does your data say?" She should not have answered that question the way the truth would have answered it. She chose a safer half-truth. "It says you are more capable of tenderness than you've been given occasion to show." The half-smile became something else, something that looked, in the low firelight, almost like pain. "Senna," he said, her name in his voice, with that weight. She had been waiting for it without knowing she was waiting for it. "You should sleep," she said quietly. "Your arm needs rest. You're redirecting. I'm being sensible. I've noticed," he said, "that you're almost always sensible. Except occasionally, in small moments, you're something else entirely." She stood, because if she didn't stand, she was going to say something that would break the careful structure she had built around herself, and she had learned, she was always learning, that the things you cannot unsay were the most dangerous. "Good night, Calum." He stood as well, and he was close enough that she could catch his scent, pine and iron, and something underneath both of those. Something warm and particular that she had learned was purely his, that she associated now with every late evening of conversation, and carefully maintained distance. The mate bond had never been formally acknowledged between them. She wasn't sure whether it existed or whether she was constructing it out of desperate hope. But when he was close, every part of her animal self went still and attentive in the way only the bond could produce. He reached out and tucked one loose strand of her hair behind her ear. A small gesture. His fingertips barely touched her. "Good night," he said. She walked to the door on legs that felt slightly unreliable. When she looked back, he was still standing by the fire, watching her go, and the expression on his face was something she was going to spend the night with. Something unfinished. Something that would dissolve by morning. It always did. Morning. She was in the physician's corridor. She spent her mornings there frequently, preparing the day's remedies in the small preparation room adjacent to the physician's chambers, when she heard his boots. She knew his walk by now the way she knew the different sounds of the palace, the tick of the main fire settling, the creak of the third stair from the top of the residential east staircase, the particular rhythm of his stride, slightly longer on the left than the right, barely noticeable, the remnant of some old injury she hadn't yet asked him about. She heard him stop outside the preparation room door. She set down the dried valerian she was measuring, braced herself, the way she did every morning, the small internal preparation that was its own kind of muscle, its own kind of wound. He looked in. Those gray eyes found her, catalogued her, moved on to the preparation tables, came back. "Good morning," he said. Polite, appropriate. The voice of a man addressing a member of his staff. "Good morning, Your Highness." "Lord Callum's herbalist?" "Yes. Senna Ashvale." "Right." He moved to enter the room, because he was looking for something on the preparation shelves. She kept the physician's supplies organized as well. It was part of her duties. And she stepped to the side and kept her breathing even. He passed close enough that she caught his scent again, and she had to stop herself, actively, physically, stop the part of her that wanted to turn toward it. "The counselors are reporting that the North Pack aggressions have escalated. I may have several injured to send to you over the next few days. I'm prepared." He glanced at her. Something very brief crossed his face. The look of a man who has noticed something slightly unusual, but hasn't yet identified what it is. She'd seen it before. It was, she thought, the bond, pressing at the walls of the curse, trying to assert itself, failing. "You seem familiar," he said. Her heart performed a complicated maneuver. "I've been here 4 months," she said carefully. "Right." He took what he'd come for, a preparation of willow bark in the old stock, and moved toward the door. "Keep the treatment rooms ready. And Ashvale." "Yes?" He paused in the doorway. "Thank you for the bandaging last night. My arm is much improved." She blinked. He remembered the bandaging. Not her. Not their conversation. Not the fire and the half-smile and the touch at the door. But the bandaging. The function of her. The service. He retained what she did and lost who she was. "Of course," she said. He left. She counted to 20, slowly, breathing in through her nose and out through her mouth the way her mother had taught her. Then she picked up the valerian again and resumed measuring, because the remedy still needed to be made, and the palace still needed tending, and she still had work to do. She had always worked better when she had something to be angry about. She went back to Oren. This time she did not frame her question obliquely. She was done being careful with him. He was in the Eastern Garden, of all places, the formal one, the one maintained for appearance rather than use, clipped low hedges in geometric patterns that said wealth and restraint in the language of horticulture. He was sitting on a stone bench with his face turned up to the weak autumn sun, his iron ring glinting, his eyes closed, He looked from a distance like a harmless old man taking the air. She sat down beside him without asking. "Miss Ashvale," he said, without opening his eyes. How uncharacteristically direct. "You removed pages from the court records." A pause. He opened his eyes. That dark brown gaze, assessor's gaze, found her and held. "Did I?" The secondary administrative ledger. 3 months around the king's death and the succession. They were excised. Carefully. "You've been thorough." "Yes." She folded her hands in her lap and looked at the clipped hedges and kept her voice even. "I also know the curse resets at dawn. I know it's been in place since approximately the succession. And I know that you knew what I was asking about the first time I came to you and chose not to tell me." Oren pressed his ring. Press, press, press. "You care for him," he said finally. It was not a question. "Tell me what you know." "What I know," Oren said slowly, "is that 5 years ago, the Alpha King who sat on that throne had just watched his father die of a curse planted by a rival pack mage, and was himself in significant danger from the same source. The working that targeted the late king was designed to unmake his bonds. Every bond, every connection that kept him rooted to his pack, his court, his life. An Alpha King without his bonds dies, Miss Ashvale. The bonds are the roots. Without them, he is just a man with power and nowhere to put it." She was very still. "The rival mage intended to use the same working on Calum," Oren continued, "and I stopped it. By replacing it with something else," she said. Oren looked at her sidelong. "I bound the working. I redirected it. The root of the original curse could not be fully removed. It had already taken hold. But I could change what it targeted. Instead of unmaking his bonds permanently, I bound it to one specific bond," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. "To whatever bond he might form, any person he might, to his mate bond." Oren's voice was very careful now. "If it formed, the original curse would have unmaking as its mechanism regardless. I could not stop the unmaking. I could only redirect what it unmade. Redirecting it to the mate bond, the one bond that would not kill him if severed, was, I believed, the safer option." "The safer option," she repeated. "For him." "Yes. Not for the person who is his mate." Silence. "I didn't know," Oren said. "When I made that choice 5 years ago, I didn't know there was a person yet." "There's one now," Senna said. He pressed his ring. "I know. And you've watched this for 5 months and said nothing." "I was not certain you were—" "You were certain." Her voice had taken on an edge she usually kept filed down. "You knew within the first week. You're the court mage. You can read bond traces in a room the way I can read a plant specimen. You knew." Oren did not deny it. "I was protecting him," he said. "The same way I always have. If someone could break that redirected curse, if someone was clever enough or motivated enough to unravel what I wove, they might expose the original working underneath, and the original working would kill him," she said. "Yes." The formal garden went very quiet. Somewhere beyond the hedges, birds were calling to each other in the language of approach and withdrawal that meant they were establishing territory. The sound of autumn, her mother used to say. Everything staking its claim before the cold. "Can it be broken?" she asked. "The redirected working?" "Yes." Oren's voice was very even. "But not by me. I am too entangled in it. The original mage who set the working is dead, and I was the one who changed its target. I am part of the structure now. Breaking it requires someone outside the working. Someone it hasn't touched. Someone like me." He looked at her. For a long moment, just looked at her. The way very old people sometimes look at the young, with something between envy and relief. The mate bond itself is the key, he said. If the bond is acknowledged, freely, completely, by both parties, without coercion or confusion, the redirected working has nothing to unmake anymore. The bond doesn't need to be hidden. It just needs to be real. He doesn't remember me by morning. I know. Every night I have to start over. I know that too. He stood slowly, with the careful movement of someone who had learned that his body required advance notice. I'm sorry, Miss Ashvale. That is inadequate, and I know that as well. She looked at her hands in her lap, the practical hands of a woman who had been making things from what was available her whole life. How long do I have? She asked. To break it. The original curse, Oren said carefully, is not static. The redirected working has been suppressing it for 5 years, and that suppression is wearing, like a bandage that has been on too long, if the redirected working is not broken properly, and soon the original will surface through it. How soon is soon? 2 months, perhaps 3, if we're fortunate. She stood. Her legs were steadier than she expected. Thank you, she said. Miss Ashvale. I'll let you know, she said quietly, how it goes. She had not allowed herself to think, until this moment. The word that lived at the center of everything she had been doing for 5 months. She had been careful, clinical, strategic about it. She had documented it in her journal like a patient's case notes. She had kept the distance between the chairs and redirected the conversations when they turned too warm, and walked through the mornings with her face arranged in the blank courtesy of someone with no particular feeling either way. She was done with that. She was Kylam Vale's fated mate. The bond had existed from the moment she walked into this palace, had been building its architecture in the dark between them through every night of careful conversation, and every morning of blank, polite dismissal, and the curse had been eating it each dawn, like a tide that comes in and takes something back. She would not let it take it back again. That evening she went to the greenhouse. She arrived before him, which she had rarely done. She arranged herself among the hanging plants and the long stone tables of growing things, and waited, and thought about what she was going to say, and discarded every prepared version of it, because every prepared version sounded like a speech, and this was not a speech. This was the most important conversation she had ever needed to have, and she was going to have to trust that she could speak honestly in the moment, because if she arrived scripted, she would arrive with distance, and she was done with distance. He came in at his usual hour. He moved through the door with the slight ease of a man who kept this space as his own, set down the thing he'd been carrying, a document case from the look of it, the council's work following him everywhere, and turned and saw her. That recalibration, that subtle adjustment of his attention. Senna, he said. Her name. He remembered it. They were still in the same calendar day, still this side of dawn. I need to tell you something, she said. He came forward. He was close enough now that the scent of him reached her properly, pine and iron, and the warmth underneath both. And her animal self went still and attentive in the way she had learned to associate with his presence. What's wrong? Nothing is wrong exactly, she breathed in. Something is wrong, or has been wrong. I've been trying to fix it, and I've reached the point where I can't fix it without your help. He was watching her carefully. Tell me. So she told him. She had rehearsed it, but the rehearsal fell away in the first minute, and what came out was just the truth, stripped of strategy. The morning he didn't recognize her after their first conversation, the journal she'd kept, the pattern she'd documented, Oren and the garden, and what the court mage had told her about the original curse and the redirected working and the mate bond at the center of all of it. She told him the whole thing. It took 20 minutes. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, the greenhouse was very quiet except for the small sounds of growing things, the faint creak of stems, the drip of water somewhere. He was standing still with his arms at his sides and his face doing something she had never seen it do before, which was nothing. Not the controlled stillness of performance. Genuine blankness. The face of a man who has received information his processing hasn't caught up with yet. She waited. "You've been watching me forget you," he said finally. "Every morning, for 5 months." "Yes." "And coming back?" "Yes." His jaw worked. "Why?" She held his gaze. "Because I know who you are when no one is watching, and I think that person is worth fighting for." Something in his face broke. Not dramatically, not the visible collapse of a lesser performance, but like the small break that happens in stone when the exact pressure point is found. A fracture line rather than a shatter. He crossed the space between them in 2 steps, and his hands came up to frame her face. Both of them. His palms warm against her jaw, and he looked at her from very close with an expression she had no word for. Something compound and aching, and finally open. "I don't remember you in the mornings," he said. "I know, but right now." His thumbs brushed her cheekbones, the lightest possible touch. "Right now I remember everything. Every night. Senna, I can feel it. The shape of something I know is important, and then it's just—" His voice did something rough and brief at the bottom. "Gone." "I know," she said again. "We're going to fix it. Tell me how." She reached up and covered his hands with hers, held them against her face. "The bond needs to be acknowledged. Freely. By both of us. And you want—" He stopped. "You would choose this. Knowing what I am. Knowing you'd have to—" "I already chose it," she said. "I chose it every morning for 5 months." He made a sound low in his throat that was not quite a word. His forehead came down to rest against hers, and they stood there for a long moment breathing the same air, and Senna felt the bond. The thing she had been carefully not calling by its name, expand in her chest like something that had been held too small for too long, and was finally allowed to take its proper shape. "I should warn you," he said, very quietly, "that my counsel is going to have approximately 40 opinions about this." "I have approximately 0 concerns about your counsel," she said. He made that sound again, and this time there was warmth in it, the edge of what would become a laugh if given enough space. "Of course you don't. Are you going to acknowledge the bond, or are you going to keep warning me about your counsel?" He pulled back just enough to see her face. The gray eyes were very clear and very close, and holding everything she had ever watched them hold in the dark hours, but never in the daylight. "Senna Ashvale," he said, "from the border territories, who grows feverfew in her quarters and drinks tea before dawn and came back every morning for 5 months to a man who couldn't remember her name. That's me. I choose you," he said. "I would choose you in the morning. I would choose you with my counsel watching. I would choose you over every alliance in the Northern Territories and every opinion in this palace." The bond answered him. She felt it. A warmth that moved through her chest and down her spine and into her bones. The deep cellular recognition of a thing clicking finally into place. It was not spectacular in the way she might have expected. It was not lightning or revelation. It was the feeling of a door opening in a room that had been closed a very long time, and finding the room warm on the other side, and realizing that the warmth had always been there, patient, waiting for exactly this. She kissed him. Not the other way around. She was very clear on this later, and it mattered to her in the way things matter that you chose. She kissed him first, her hands moving from his to his jaw, and he kissed her back with the focused entirety of a man who had been waiting for permission and was now entirely through waiting and the greenhouse held them in the smell of green things and wood smoke, and the particular warm iron pine of him that she had memorized through months of careful, aching restraint. The night was long. She was not going to document this in her journal. He told her things she suspected his father had never been told, had never wanted to hear. About the 3 months after the old king's death, which was what had been in the removed pages. Caleb had removed them himself, she now knew, because those months had held the complete collapse and slow reassembly of a man who had understood too late what his inheritance actually cost. He died alone, he said, because he had spent 30 years keeping everyone at a careful distance, and one morning he needed someone, and there was no one. I decided that was the correct way to live, that the strength was in the not needing. And now? She asked, the echo of their earlier conversation. The one he didn't know was an echo. Now, he said, I think the strength might be in the asking. She held that. They talked until the fire went low and then lower, until the eastern sky began doing what it did, the long gray reaching. She watched it through the greenhouse glass and felt the approach of it the way you feel weather. It's almost dawn, she said. He looked at the sky. His face was doing something she had never seen daylight do to it. Will it? He stopped. Will I? I don't know, she said honestly. Oren said if the acknowledgement was genuine, the working would break. But I don't know exactly when, or how, and if it doesn't break. His voice was very even. Tomorrow morning. Then I'll come find you, she said. I'll introduce myself. I'll tell you my name and where I'm from, and I'll find a reason to be near you until you remember why I feel like someone you already know. I've been doing it for 5 months. I'm very good at it. His jaw tightened. She could read him now, completely, in the way the mate bond allows reading. Not telepathy, nothing so clean, but the emotional resonance of a close-tuned instrument, and what he was feeling right now was not fear. It was something close to rage, the delayed fury of someone who has just understood the shape of what was done to him. Someone cursed me to forget you, he said. Every morning, for 5 months. Yes, the same someone who... He stopped. He had heard Oren's explanation from her telling of it, and she watched him assemble the complicated moral geometry of it. The court mage who had, technically, saved his life with a solution that had cost her 5 months of this. Caleb, she said, don't defend him. I wasn't going to. He looked at her. Weren't you? He made a choice that I would probably have made in his position, she said carefully, and it caused me considerable pain. Both things are true. I'm going to let them both be true for a while before I decide how I feel about him. He was quiet. Then, you are the most infuriatingly balanced person I have met in my life. I know. It's annoying. His mouth moved. That almost smile, the one she had catalogued, the one that lived just to the left of amusement. It is, he agreed. The light was graying. The first kitchen fires would be starting soon. He reached out and took her hand. Not urgently, with the deliberateness of a man making a choice. He held it, and she held it back, and they waited together for whatever the morning was going to do. It was not like the other mornings. She felt it at the moment of dawn. Not saw, felt, the way you feel the shift of tide before you see the water move. The bond between them flared briefly, warm and sharp as a struck match, and then it didn't go out. It steadied. It held. She looked at him. He was watching her. I remember you, he said. She made no sound. The sound was too big. I remember, he said again, slowly, like testing the weight of each word. The first time you introduced yourself, the greenhouse. You told me about your mother's hands. You said they smelled of lemon verbena. Something moved across his face, compound, and careful, and very, very open. I remember every conversation, every evening. His voice dropped. Every morning I forgot. Her throat was full. Every morning, he said, with the particular controlled anger of a man who keeps his fury very quietly because it runs very deep. You came back. Yes, she managed. He crossed the space between them and gathered her into him, both arms around her, completely. Not the tentative close but not touching of the previous months, but the full, claiming warmth of someone who has been waiting to do this without knowing they were waiting. She pressed her face into his chest and felt his heartbeat, the deep, steady pack alpha beat of it, and she breathed in the scent of him, pine and iron and warmth. And the greenhouse light turned from gray to gold, and the working that had been eating at their bond for 5 months dissolved like mist. She wept briefly, not dramatically, just the quiet release of something that had been held too long. He held her through it without saying anything, which was exactly correct. The court found out the way courts always find out, not through announcement but through accumulation of evidence. A maid saw them walking in the south corridor with their hands interlocked. A guard noticed the Alpha King's gaze tracking her across the morning audience chamber with the specific, unhurried attention of a man who is watching something that belongs entirely to him. The council found out when Calum told them. Directly, in the morning session, without preamble. I have formed a mate bond, he said, with Senna Ashvale, the palace herbalist. I am informing you of this as a courtesy and not as a request for opinion. The silence in the council chamber had its own texture, thick, layered, several different kinds of outrage and calculation, and, from Lord Callum in the far left seat, a single slow nod that might have been satisfaction. Lord Heron, who led the northern faction and had been pushing the Stonefeld alliance hardest, said, Your Highness, the border territories family would be... Lord Heron. Calum's voice was very calm. I did not ask. Pack law regarding the Alpha's bond does require counsel. Pack law requires notification of the bond. He looked at Heron with the gray eyes that gave nothing away and everything away simultaneously. I have notified you. We're finished. Senna, standing in the back of the room, she had not been invited, and she had not been stopped, and she had discovered in the last 12 hours that the combination of mate bond and the Alpha King's full awareness of it had reconfigured her relationship to this palace in ways she was still mapping. Felt the warmth of his certainty reach her from across the room. Lord Heron was not finished. Powerful men rarely were, in her experience, when they felt a loss of control. The girl has no pack standing, Heron said. The word girl landed with intentional weight. She has no alpha blood, no political alliance, no... She has mine. Calum turned his head and looked at her, directly, across the room, in front of the full council, with every bit of what he felt visible in his face. That is sufficient. The room went very quiet. Heron's face did something complicated. He looked from Calum to Senna and back again, the calculation behind his eyes visible, the reassessment of what he was dealing with. He sat back. He was not done. She knew that. Men like Heron were never done after a single defeat. They simply relocated their angle of attack. But for now, in this room, with the Alpha King's gray eyes on her, and the bond steady and warm in her chest, she let herself feel the solid ground of this moment. Calum held her gaze for one more second. Then he looked back at his council and said, mildly, Shall we address the northern incursions? There was a moment, later, that she understood she would carry for the rest of her life. Lyra Stonefeld had come to the palace. She had come with her father and a retinue of 12, and she was exactly what the council's preference for her had suggested she would be. beautiful in the formal, deliberate way of a woman who had been preparing for exactly this kind of audience for years, with the high-boned face and dark gold hair, and the physical composure of a pack alpha's daughter trained to every nuance of political presentation. She had not known about the bond. Nobody had told her. She came into the Eastern reception hall and found Calum there, and she smiled the practiced smile of a woman who had been told a specific thing was available and was simply arriving to claim it. Her gaze moved past Senna completely, Senna in her herbalist's apron, her brown hair braided back, her grandmother's clay cup absent because she was not in her quarters, visibly none of the things that Lyra Stonefeld understood as relevant. And Calum crossed the room, not toward Lyra. He came to Senna, and his hand found the small of her back with the ease of something practiced, natural, already habitual after 12 hours, and he said, "Lady Stonefeld, may I introduce my mate?" Lyra Stonefeld's smile did not collapse. She was too well trained for that. But her eyes found Senna's in a way that was not quite assessment and not quite dismissal. Something recalibrating, like Calum in doorways, like everyone who had underestimated Senna and then had to revise. Senna met her eyes steadily and said, "It's a pleasure. I hope your journey was comfortable." She felt Calum's hand press slightly at her back, that barely visible pressure. She thought she understood him well enough now to read it. Quiet pride, not performance, the real kind. Lyra's father, who was older and more pragmatic, recovered faster. He turned to Calum and said, in the voice of a man shifting strategy in real time, "Perhaps there are other arrangements to discuss." "There are," Calum agreed pleasantly. "Trade routes and border protections primarily. My mate has particular expertise in the border territories, which will be useful." He looked at Senna, briefly, with the expression that still did something violent to her ability to breathe normally. "She tends to be useful." "You're making me sound like a tool," she said, which she had not intended to say aloud. "A very significant tool," he said, with absolute seriousness, and the warmth under it reached her clearly through the bond, and she pressed her lips together against something that was trying to be a smile. Oren came to her that evening. He found her in the south greenhouse. Her greenhouse now, in some unofficial way that had solidified over the past 2 days. And she saw him coming through the glass panels, his slow, deliberate walk, the iron ring catching the late light. She waited. He came in and stood for a moment among the growing things, looking at the arrangement of plants with the eyes of a man who could read their purposes. "The working is fully dissolved," he said. "I can no longer detect it." "I know. The original curse." "Is it gone?" she asked. "Yes." He pressed his ring. The acknowledgement of the bond was sufficiently complete. The target the original curse needed to attack no longer exists. There is no isolated bond to unmake. You are too interwoven. Something in his voice was very quiet. "It worked." "You weren't sure it would." "No." She looked at a cluster of rosemary growing in the corner, which needed trimming. "He's angry with you," she said. "I know." "Are you going to tell him why you made the choice you made?" "The full version, not the diplomatic version you gave me." Oren was quiet for a long moment. "There is a version," he said slowly, "in which I made a desperate choice at 2 a.m. while a 24-year-old king was dying of his father's curse, and I had approximately 4 minutes to redirect a working that would otherwise have killed him in the same way, and the choice I made was the only one with a survivable outcome, even if the cost of that outcome was not mine to pay." "Yes," she said. "That version. Tell him that version. He may not forgive it. He might not," she agreed, "but he'll understand it. He's better at understanding than people give him credit for. She finally looked at Orrin. And you should stop protecting him from the truth of what was done in his name. He spent 5 years in a court full of people managing his information. He deserves better than that from the person closest to him. Orrin pressed his ring. Press, press, press. You are very difficult, he said. I've been told. She went back to her rosemary. Thank you, Orrin, for the choice you made, whatever the cost, and for telling me the truth when I pushed hard enough. A pause. Then the sound of him walking back toward the door. Miss Ashvale, he said from the doorway. She looked up. You are precisely what he needed, Orrin said. I am only sorry it took me so long to say so. The mornings changed. She didn't stop waking before dawn. She had been doing it for 5 months, and her body had committed to it. And she found that she still preferred the hour before the palace fully woke. The tea. The quiet. The cold stone smell coming through the cracked shutter. But now she was not alone in her room when she woke. He was a light sleeper. It was one of the things she was still learning about him. The catalog of everyday detail that long courtship of evenings had started but left incomplete. He slept on his left side. He woke at the smallest sound. He was approximately 40% more sardonic before his first meal than after it, and he kept a book on the table beside the bed, even though she had not yet seen him read it. She was sitting in the window seat with her tea on the 4th morning, their 4th shared morning, the mornings she had started thinking of as the new mornings, when he woke and found her there. He lay still for a moment, looking at her across the room. The dawn light was the same as it always was. That long gray reaching, the sky doing its slow, patient work. His gray eyes were very clear. You're still doing that, he said. Drinking tea before dawn? Yes. I'm not going to stop. Good, he said. Not surprised. The word carried the weight of a man cataloging a preference, adding it to a growing list. He pushed himself up slowly and came to sit beside her in the window seat, and she passed him the tea because there was 1 cup, and he looked like he needed it, and she'd had most of it anyway. He drank, looked out at the courtyard below, waking slowly in the pale light. The council has scheduled a formal hearing, he said, about the Stonefeld alliance. I anticipate it will be long and involve at least 2 people who believe I have lost my mind. Heron and who else? Probably Vance. He's more subtle about it, which makes him more work. He handed her back the cup. I was thinking you might attend. She looked at him. As your mate. As yourself. Who happens to be my mate? She turned the cup in her hands. Outside, the first birds were starting. The high and low call of the gray finches that nested in the east tower. Back and forth. Back and forth. The small, ordinary sound of a world going about its business. I have a condition, she said. I assumed you would. If Heron calls me girl again, I'm responding to it. I have no objection to that, he said, with the slight dryness she was learning to recognize as the form his humor took when he was allowing himself to find something genuinely funny. In fact, I would pay a considerable fee to watch it. She laughed. The sound surprised her slightly. It was an easy laugh, the kind that comes out before you decide to let it, and she thought this was going to be the shape of their life. Small, unguarded sounds, the accumulation of ordinariness, the long project of learning someone who was already known. He watched her laugh. His face was doing the thing it did when he thought she wasn't looking, the unperformed thing, the thing that lived below the controlled stillness and the gray authority. Warm, specific, the look of a man who had found something and intended to keep it. She found the missing sibling on a Tuesday. She hadn't been looking. She had been cross-referencing the border territory records for the council hearing, building her case for the trade route restructuring that would make the Stonefeld military alliance less necessary, and she found it in a margin note in a secondary correspondence log from 3 years prior. A reference to a ward of the Crown, removed to the Northern Sanctuary by order of, and here the handwriting changed, the signature blurred, the record incomplete in the particular way of something that had been partially redacted and partially simply left unfinished. A ward of the Crown. Calum had no siblings. She knew this. His parents had had one son, and the Alpha King had died. And then Calum. Unless. She sat with the incomplete record and felt the shape of the gap it made, and understood that this was one of those things she would need to place in Calum's hands, and then step back and let him hold. Whatever was in those margins was his to know first. She folded the page carefully and slipped it into her apron pocket. That evening, in the greenhouse, she gave it to him. He read it twice. His face went through something she didn't interpret, didn't try to. This was his, the privacy of it. And she understood that love was also knowing when to not watch. A ward of the Crown, he said finally. It's from 3 years ago, before I arrived. Oren, he said, and the word had something different in it now. Not rage, not quite, but the slow, careful anger of someone rearranging what they know. Maybe, she said, or maybe your father, or maybe someone else entirely. It's incomplete. He looked at the margin note for a long time. Then he folded it back along its crease lines, precise and careful. The way he did things when he was feeling something strongly and routing it into his hands. He put it in his own breast pocket, close to his chest. I'll find them, he said. Not a question, not a request for permission or opinion, just the quiet certainty of a man who has found a thread and understands that the only direction is forward. I know, she said. He looked at her. The greenhouse held them in its smell of growing things and the faint smoke of the palace fires, and the light outside was doing that long evening gold that she had been watching for 5 months through this very glass. You'll help me look, he said. It was not a question either. She reached out and took the hand that was holding the folded record, his fingers still pressed against the paper, and she held it in both of hers. Yes, she said. The bond did not feel like she had imagined it would feel. She had expected something dramatic, something seismic, something that announced itself the way the old stories announced their magic, light and sound and the world rearranged into before and after. She had been raised on those stories, the same ones every border territory girl was raised on. The alpha bond like a lightning strike, the fated mate like a recognition that stopped all other thought. What she had instead was this: the smell of him in the room when she woke, the warmth of the cup she handed him across the window seat, the particular quality of his silence when he was thinking through something difficult, which she could read now like weather, like the creak of the stair, like the sound of the finches calling from the east tower. The way he sometimes looked at her from across a room as though she were a thing he had been certain was impossible, and was still, on some level, adjusting to the fact of. She had waited 119 mornings for him to know her, and here he was, knowing her, choosing to know her in the daylight, in front of his council and his court, and a Stonefeld delegation that had not been expecting this particular arrangement. Choosing her, with his hands and his voice, and the deliberate, unperformed attention of someone who had been alone in a specific way for a long time, and had found, in a small room with a clay cup on the windowsill, and dried plants hanging from the ceiling, and a woman who was done being sensible, the thing he hadn't known he was looking for. There was still a thread in the margins, a ward of the Crown, removed somewhere north. incomplete in the particular way of something that had been protected or hidden. There were still border incursions, and a council with at least 2 members who were going to make this difficult, and Oren's long accounting to be settled, and the work of a mate bond taken seriously rather than performed. All of that was still ahead. But the morning was gold through the greenhouse glass, and his hand was warm in hers, and she had kept her grandmother's clay cup for exactly this kind of day, the kind that earns its warmth slowly, over time, through the patient accumulation of all the days you stayed when leaving would have been easier. She had stayed. She was still here. And when she looked at him now, this man who had forgotten her 119 times and would never forget her again, he looked back the way the sun looks at the thing it's been working to reach all morning, already certain, already warm, already sure.